So we'll go ahead and kick this off. What do you say, Dr. Sorty? All right, welcome everyone. We are delighted that you're joining us for today's webinar. We have a few housekeeping notes to go over before we get started. If you have any technical or audio issues using this platform, please use the chat box and send a message directly to all panelists and we will respond right away. Please note, everyone's lines have been automatically muted, but we do want this to be an interactive session. So we encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation by entering them into the Q&A box in the toolbar on your screen. At the end of the presentation, we'll answer as many questions as possible in the allotted amount of time. This session will be recorded and you will receive a thank you email along with an on-demand materials within a few days. So why are we all here? Supply chain has never made as many headlines in the news and social media as it has in the past 12 months. From resilient stories on ensuring a certain normalcy in our activities to taking center stage of trade war conversations, as well as focus on governmental executive orders. Supply chain management is no longer a specialty, but has become an ecosystem strategy supporting competitive advantage. Recent events, demographic and environmental changes, and continued volatility have shaken long-lasting supply principles and raised several questions. Is global sourcing into low-cost countries the best scenario? How do we deal with costly, insufficient shipping? How do we anticipate events and strategically plan through data analytics? How do we meet increasing demand for our consumers? These and many other questions are the center of several debates at the moment. For the purposes of this presentation, we'll focus on how do they affect the marine industry. My name is Scott Berry, Director of Engineering Standards for NMMA. I would like to welcome everyone again to today's presentation on supply chain opportunities and challenges, a fireside chat to explore supply chain management in a global post-pandemic context. We have a special guest speaker today from the University of Tennessee, Dr. Andrea Sordi. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Sordi. And we'll kick things off. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. Thank you very much, Scott, and everybody for joining today. It's been a real pleasure to be here. So my name is Andrea Sordi. I'm Italian by origin, so not really, the accent isn't really from Tennessee, but I'm a clinical professor in supply chain management at the University of Tennessee, the Aslam School of Business. But before that, I spent 20 years in the FMCG industry, covering several leadership roles in the supply chain, and more recently in procurement, in particularly running strategic transformation and organizational transformations in across the globe. I work for Kraft Foods, Danone, and Mondelez, so very much into the food industry, but with a relevance in trading and commodities and across the globe. My current activity is obviously teaching and researching, particularly in the supply chain sustainability agenda and economic inclusion and supplier diversity. Guess you're on mute, Scott.
Okay, sorry about that, unmute. Thank you for providing that information, and we'll jump right into the questions if you're ready that we've been receiving from our members over the past few months. So, in the past 18 months, we've witnessed unprecedented events that have shaken some of the strategies supply chain professionals have implemented over the previous decade. Most notably, a pandemic has been a catalyst to consider the advantage A pandemic has been a catalyst to reconsider the advantage or risk of a global supply economy. Trade wars, both public and more silent, will no doubt have an impact on our supply chains. An example in the marine industry would be the 10 to 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel discussed at the American Boating Congress a few years ago. Big picture, are American businesses going to nearshore all our sourcing? And what is your general view, and more specifically, your view for the marine industry?
Well, that's a great question, Scott. And, I think it's a question that all supply chain professionals are trying to answer at the moment. And I don't think anyone has a clear opinion or a clear view. It all depends on the industry and the context. So I'm going to give you a general answer, which is a very consulting answer. So it depends. My belief is that I don't think into extreme solutions. And where I believe the supply chain strategy is gonna turn to is in rediscovering what I would call a right shoring strategy. And in terms of sourcing, what someone in the past called kind of a local sourcing approach. What I mean by that, I mean that you need to find a balance. I don't think extreme works. There are materials and sourcing that can be sourced from multiple places, that can have redundant or backup solutions, that can be sourced near shore. Others, by the nature of the material, can't only be sourced offshore. So in that scenario, the questions becomes how you can control and you manage that context, that environment. And just to bring you one experience I had very early in my career, I was then a sourcing manager in Europe and working on supply chain strategies. And back in the days, early 2000, there was this dynamic of moving every single production from Western to Eastern Europe because mainly of labor arbitrage reasons. Now, we never moved everything completely 100% for, to keep a sort of ability to come back and to balance and manage any risk. And you know what, this scenario that played out very quickly was that, well, that labor arbitrage that existed, it was the main reason to move east, all of a sudden start going down, and there wasn't that much difference. And the other thing is that you really don't want to sell out and give away all your core competencies or your core critical items, because it's going to be very expensive to buy them back and to build them back into your scenario, into your supply chain. If I look at the U.S. marine industry in particularly, but the marine industry tends to be more manufacturing into domestic geographies. But again, in there, I think there's the right sourcing apply as well. I mean, the example you made about the increase in tariffs is obviously putting a stretch to the global dynamics. You could find scenarios and opportunity close to home where to source those material or create those manufacturing capabilities. But at the same time, if you think other scenarios like the resins, your industry is suffering, but they're not coming necessarily from far away. They're just coming from around the corner. The main source of issues in resins shortage is a snowstorm in Texas. And that doesn't really relate with offshoring or nearshoring. That's a matter of management of an increased volatility in the supply chain. So again, I think the right approach, in my view, what supply chain is going to be looking at is really making sure to keep the right balance where you can create multiple sourcing points. It's great. You diminish the risk, you create more competitiveness. Where you can't, you just need to be able to anticipate and play in a forward-looking scenario.
Okay, so you used an interesting perspective about right shoring. I understand we'll continue monitoring global dynamics and adapt our U.S. strategies accordingly, but how will we be able to anticipate and proactively prepare before those waves arrive? Any tips, examples, or best practices from other industries that the marine business might find useful or be able to adapt?
Yeah, sure. I'm going to say something in here that might not sound that innovative, kind of a deja vu, but I'm going to be going very basics. I mean, for me, the three key elements are related to process, tools, and people. And I'm taking the parallel to my experience in the food industry. Now, the slight difference is what kind of elements you put in these three buckets, the competencies bucket. So if I start, for example, with process, I think in supply chain, we have downplayed risk management. Over the past, we have downplayed risk management to privilege efficiency, to privilege lean, to privilege bottom line increase and growth. But we created a supply chain which is based on scale and lean, which doesn't really apply to what is today needed, which is flexibility and agility. It's, you know, I was talking to someone the other day and making this example of the Titanic navigating, sailing in the middle of an iceberg area in the ocean. Now, if you have a small boat, it's easier to turn and navigate and slaloming in between. If you try to move a big boat, which is a scale and massive, it becomes more difficult. So we need to create these kind of processes that are looking at risk management in a way to be able to anticipate all possible scenarios. And when those scenarios turns to be a reality, act with agility. Now, how you can anticipate, and here is where the tools come to play. We're sitting on an ocean of data. I'm not saying ocean because we are in kind of a marine, context, but there's a lot of data out there. And supply chain, again, we have spent many years, myself included, in looking at how we can perfect data accuracy, how we can invest in data solutions that make 100% data accurate. You know what? The reality is that we spend so much time to get to that perfection of forecast, and then we miss the ability to anticipate and ensure that we have availability of materials enough to serve the 80% of our business. So we just need to make sure that we turn that analytics into directionally good data to take decisions and insights, to be able to understand what those different scenarios mean and how we should be acting on those scenarios. And then the third element is about the people. So if you think about those those risk management competencies that you need, the use of those tools, are our supply chain professional able and capable and ready, have the right skill set to be able to take those insights, to be digitally savvy, to be comfortable with an 80-20 approach, with a directional approach? Is our supply chain management able to be comfortable and take a risk and take decisions on an 80-20 approach? So those are the kind of three things that, I believe are important if you really want to create a supply chain which is kind of redundant and funded in anticipation and agility.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Thank you for that response. So during the introduction, you noted you have 20 years experience in the food industry, which is significantly consumer driven, but have large dependencies on global sourcing, especially when it comes to certain commodities. First thing that comes to mind when I think of boats is teak wood, for example. Can you share any best practices when it comes to managing supply and price volatility?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that all the food industry in the last 18 months have performed absolutely all great. I mean, I guess we learn on the fly too, as many others. I mean, some perform better than others. For example, my previous employer, Mondelez, has performed nicely. And that's because the transformation of the supply chain and the procurement function started a little bit earlier on. So they were kind of better ready to the storm. But I think from the first part of your questions about how you can manage that global sourcing scenario. So I think there are three elements again that I would consider critical. So the importance of having a global footprint, and that could be your company, it could be your industry, it could be your trade association, it could be your network or ecosystem. But the fact of in this pandemic, having operations in China allowed many companies, Mondelez, Yum, others, Taco Bell, Kentucky Fried Chicken, all those kind of companies, to understand what the impact of the pandemic was in China, in Asia, and then in Europe, and then anticipate the effect in the US. So kind of they had less of a burden or an impact because they learned up front and they transferred that learning as the pandemic was moving east to west. and that's another reason that nearshoring doesn't help in that case either. Then I would say the second second tips is having a strong internal and external governance, and that allows you to, in the example you made about the marine industry or commodities in the food industry, to work with your supplier upstream, tier 1 or tier 2, in a really integrated way, in a real partnership way, in a manner that when issues come and shortage come, you put your joint brain and your joint capabilities together and try to find different approaches, different solutions, alternative materials, or alternative scenarios or alternative way to shipping, somehow working together to solve the short-term issues and plan for solve for the long-term issues. Internally, because you really want to be aligned internally with across functions in the supply chain and across the business to really take critical decisions. One of the decisions that was made, often made in the food industry, in my experience, when shortages come, you go back to the basic business. You limit the SKUs that are very personalized, very minimal, and you really focus on the mainstream, the ones that drive your revenue, the ones that drive your volumes, the ones that keep your consumers, the trust of your consumers, or the way you can deliver there. And that's the most important thing, because sooner or later the business is going to come back and you really don't want to lose that trust. And the third element that is critical in my opinion is, again, people. I mean, what I've seen during the past 18 months in the food industry is really, at least the food industry I've experienced, is really people, creativity and resilience to come to play. And, and I'm sure in your industry too, and trying to find any kind of solution, any kind of scenario, working more hours than's possibly humanly possible to really overcome any single obstacle. To your second part of the question about the price volatility, again, governance come to play, and what I've seen applied in my experience in the supply chain is a tight governance between procurement and finance in managing price volatility and hedging far in advance. And when I'm saying far in advance, I'm talking 18, 24 months, really locking quantity or locking prices for the critical item, and being able to work with finance on now to transfer those impact or those scenario based on the decisions that are taken into final pricing to consumers, to balance the financial impact of those hedging decisions. And if you look at the scenario we are assisting now, with transportation going up, all sorts of commodities going up, in the mid-long term, I would invest in those kind of governance body and competencies to really be able to hedge and look forward into the commodity, in locking some kind of a commodity stability.
Okay, excellent. Some great advice there. Thank you. Switching gears a little bit, another important aspect in our industry, and I'm sure in your experience, is innovation. The marine industry is constantly innovating to seek the best production efficiencies and striving to meet the consumer expectations. The NMMA CSI program is a great example of direct voice of the customer. Innovation often comes from new suppliers, other industries, and design. Can you share any tips on how to identify the best supplier and manage that relationship with the supplier?
So, first of all, I think what you have to understand is why you innovated. What's the main reason why you're innovating? And, it's kind of the same thing that happened in digitization. You often see organizations digitizing and starting with the tool they want to implement, and then creating a business case around that tool, and that doesn't work. It's like, you go and buy an Apple Watch, but you are absolutely not digitally teching. It's like you don't use it. And the same thing on innovation. So if I see, for example, myself, I would love to go and enjoy recreational boating, but I don't even know where to start to, the game. So for me, it should be, the ideal innovation should be a self-driven boat and that can handle alone. And, I'm just sitting there and enjoying the day. Now that's my extreme example. So I'm sure that most of your consumers are in a better situation than me. And the point is understanding the reason why, the business reason why your consumer wants you to innovate, and then going out and looking for that. The second fact is internal alignment. I've seen very often innovation failing because internally, procurement, supply chain, in engineering, for example, are not aligning exactly on what they want to innovate, what the innovation looks like, with whom should we working. And, and I think it's important that internal alignment is clear before you even go and scout the market for a potential supplier that can, or ecosystem supplier that can provide that solution. Because otherwise you're going to confuse people and you don't transfer trust. And what supplier might think is that your innovation is going to turn down in 6 months, so they're not going to invest themselves into that journey. And the other element is that it's unlikely that you can find an innovation end-to-end from one supplier. So you might need to put together more firms outside, more vendors outside, that are creating yourself an ecosystem that can provide that end-to-end innovative solution, each one providing their best component and the best piece. But that also requires that from a procurement standpoint, you leave aside the traditional approach of going and hard negotiating, bargaining kind of scenario, and really be invested in more long-term partnership and long-term contracting solutions that, for example, in my industry, didn't happen that often. Potential likely in your industry might be a better situation in that case. And I would say the other thing, sorry to add, one other option that you have to innovate that very often gets forgotten into the context. We think that the bigger innovator are the bigger supplier, but there's a bunch of small and medium enterprises out there that represent very often 80% of the business entities in each and every geography, and diverse businesses are proven to be between 20 and 30% more creative than traditional businesses. So that's an untapped opportunity that as part of the research I'm doing, and is becoming more evident that we're trying to push organizations to really consider those alternatives.
Oh, that's an interesting statistic there. So another big concern for our industry, and you touched on this briefly before, is sourcing consolidation, meaning fewer players, fewer suppliers. What is your experience with consolidation, and how do businesses evaluate and manage that risk? And what are the redundancies in sourcing best practice approach?
So as I mentioned, I've never been very much a believer or a fan of a complete supplier consolidation. I mean, putting too many eggs in the same basket, it doesn't sound as, a reasonable solution for everything. I think a big push back in the days for supply consolidation was the efficiency in managing the administrative side of those relationships. Part of the scale effect that exists in gathering volumes and having a better price, but there's a kind of a break even to that scale effect at a certain level. And the other reason was, taking the burden out of too many administrative activities. That second aspect can be solved with technology. Today, you have technology that absorb that manual work without necessarily putting at risk all your sourcing in one player. Then the other thing is that you need to consider is how critical is the material that you're sourcing or the service you're sourcing is, and if you have choices. If you have choices, I think creating an alternative scenario that could be a backup solution with the same player in a different location, on a different asset, or a different supplier, or balancing volume across, is a safer solution and can generate competitiveness in the market at the same time. If you don't have a choice because the nature of the material, the service is limiting you, then at that point in time, I think the reasonable approach is really partnering with that vendor, with that supplier, and really consolidating the relationship to a point that which is so interrelated that the maintenance of the keeping that business is a reason for competitive advantage, and you need each other the same way, and you just wanna foster the business relationship for as long as you can.
Okay, some good advice there. Thank you. And switching gears to shipping and logistics. So global shipping is facing huge challenges, from shortage of containers to the Suez Canal events of the past weeks, all challenging reliability of shipment and timely deliveries. From what you can see, how are companies addressing these concerns? Are they opening new routes, looking at new port deliveries, increasing inventories and stocks? What's your experience with this?
I think the answer is all of the above, depending again on the industry and the situation. I think the current crisis you see, the current complexity you see, is driven by different factors. One, there's a huge imbalance of containers because of the change in the imbalance on trade flows. Because of trade wars, because of the pandemic, because the increase of e-commerce due to the pandemic, there's a huge imbalance. So you have containers in the wrong side of the world when most of the goods need to be shipped out of China. The other issue is that kind of a temporary situation. All the lockdowns and the pandemic has impacted personnel. So there was less personnel in the destination ports to unload the vessels, and that slowed down completely all the activities. Added to when you get on the road on the continent, where there's a transportation limitation because of the driver shortage. So that's adding all the confusion. The third element, that I see that takes a little bit longer to solve is the infrastructure. Because of the trade flows on ocean freight has been growing, we ended up with big vessels moving around the globe. But those big vessels then dock in the same places and get out of the gate on the same number of roads and through the same customs agencies. So it's kind of you're just moving the bottleneck from the sea to the inland. And it's like when they first came with the A380, if you remember, the double deck thing. They decided, oh, that's a great thing, but then they realized that most of the airport had very few gates, and most of the airport didn't, and no airport had the two jet bridge to board and get a passenger off. So I mean, the infrastructure wasn't there, so they had to reinvent the infrastructure. Now, where all of this is going, difficult to say. I mean, I think it's going to take at least 3 to 6 months to see a sort of pre-COVID or kind of a normal situation. That's the estimate. I think there's a need, though, to investment in the infrastructure anyway, in personnel and automation. Call it, automation in the port movement and the port activities. Call it automation of blockchain in the custom processing. Don't wait the vessel coming in. It's just processing things through while the shipment is on the way. And then the other thing is look into alternative entry point. I had an example. I have a few students that works for a software company. Sorry, a hardware company that most inputs are coming from China. So they were just shipping to LA, and they experience all the delays that you all have experienced. Now, part of a study they're doing for one of the courses I'm teaching is that they realized that actually the majority of their customers are sitting on the East Coast. So they were adding, by design and by habits, sort of a bottleneck into their supply chain where they can enjoy other ports of entry and change their network. So a re-understanding that how your route to market work can provide solution and alternative scenario that might de-risk your supply chain from a shipping perspective. And then the last thing is that I would say going forward is the more we can directionally anticipate and forecast the capacity we need, the better we are able to lock that capacity, negotiating with carriers upfront and ahead of time, and reserving that capacity. And not only reserving the capacity is trying to lock as possible the price of those shipments and avoiding to buy the majority on an open market where you are completely, you can be lucky or you can be very, very unlucky, like in these days.
Okay, and linked to the previous question and to the continuous volatility in material pricing, how much do you think a more accurate forecast is a key mitigating factor?
Yeah, as I was saying, I think it's first of all what accurate forecast is. I mean, 75%, 80%, 50%. What's good, what's bad, and again, we're getting to the what's directionally correct. In my opinion, I think it's better being directionally correct, but be fast in sharing that information, that visibility through the chain upstream, and ensuring that you have capacity enough, that you have visibility on pricing, that you can anticipate a gain. I'm going to the same concept. I'm sorry to be redundant of that, but I think it's really the way forward. Rather than trying to be absolutely perfect on forecasting and missing the train, or in finding in a situation where there's no capacity any longer, or I'm paying as hell, or I'm paying in anticipation to get some capacity. And it's not only about shipment; it's also about equipment. If you really want to be able to provide visibility to your suppliers, especially if they are partners. The interesting thing is in your industry, now you have a lot of huge demand growing, like that's great, with backlog that goes until probably, if I read that right, until 2022, 2023 in some cases. And new fans of recreational boating coming in, new generations coming in. I think the other interesting factor of forecasting is how can you shape that demand going forward? Meaning, not only you predict that demand is going to be staying that level, or what's the right level, but how can you shape that demand? So if you understand what your new consumer are going to need, how can you propose product in a way kind of forcing that demand or shaping that demand? And that makes the forecasting a little bit easier your way.
Okay, excellent. And recently, sustainability and ESG are making news headlines and a focus of investor calls. What is the role of supply chain in driving more sustainable practices, and where should our industry's supply chain focus their attention?
So yeah, sustainability is another sustainability supply chain. I think they're making the headlines on any news channels and any kind of political debate at the moment. I mean, I think from what I've investigated about your industry, you're doing pretty well. I think in the recent past, I mean, there's been a 70% reduction on greenhouse gases emission. Your innovation is increased by 40-50%, the fuel efficiency on your boat. But there's a focus on ESG, the environmental, social, and governmental strategies and approaches from consumers. There are statistics out there that shows that 70% of new generations are really choosing their product and their employer even on the base of sustainability commitment. And also there's an increased attention of investor company. There was a recent report from BlackRock in February this year mentioning that they're going to move their control and interest on 2,000 companies that are representing the 90% of Scope 1 and Scope 2 greenhouse gases emission. And that's a huge quantity. And what happens is that in last year, in 2020, they almost controlled quite a significant number of boards and turned down some executive because of no commitment on ESG. So I think sustainability is becoming again one critical factor, but it's not only greenhouse gases and environmental commitment, it's also social commitment. So diversity and inclusion, how can you leverage small businesses, veterans businesses? How can you, small and medium enterprises? How can you create a supply chain in the marine industry that is even more inclusive and sustainable in the future, and at the same time is driving innovation, creativity? You can brand yourself to new generations of potential consumers as a supply chain and an industry which is attentive to those kind of aspects that are really in the interest of those new generation, those new consumer groups. So that makes sense, Scott.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thanks for that feedback. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to jump into the Q&A, the questions that we've received during the seminar. The first question: transportation costs increase in 2021. What should we as the marine industry expect or plan for, in your opinion?
Well, there are different things that drive that increase. One is the shortage of containers. I mean, that imbalance, which we say referring is going to take between 3 and 6 months to get back to a certain level. Inland is the shortage of drivers because of all COVID things. So hopefully the vaccinations and it's going to keep rolling out and get ourselves to a sort of normalcy scenario. But really, my advice would really be looking beyond the next 6 months and try to go and work upstream to lock capacity and prices in transportation prices far in advance for the late part of 2021 and for 2022. What you don't really want to find yourself into the scenario is that, residents come back into your warehouses. You can be able to, fulfill your customer orders, but then you are not able to find a way to ship those orders out because, you haven't reserved those capacity in transportation upfront, or you must pay a lot to make that happen. And obviously it's too late to reflect on your customer price and you're going to be reducing your profitability.
Mm-hmm. And we received another question kind of in line with that. Due to the blank sailings, we cannot get all the weekly allocation we signed up for. How do we move product that is needed without paying over $10,000 per 40-foot container?
Well, I think in the short term, I'm afraid that you can only, if you haven't reserved that, the only thing is paying the spot market and trying to find the best way the best moment to buy. So you just need to get a sort of analytics that are following that market and understanding if there are trends in those movement of pricing that you can take advantage of. Again, my suggestion is go and anticipate what's coming next in the next 3-6 months, when the market is, when the balance is going to go back into a sort of normalcy. Price is not going to be coming down immediately. There's always a lag between, kind of a state of normalcy and pricing seeing the effect. And you really want to make sure that you work that up front, and you negotiate that up front, and you're paying the financial consequences on top of the physical consequences for too long than needed.
Okay. And another question we received is best ports in a shipping crisis. Do you have any recommendations for best ports to ship products through?
I would go to my city in Italy, but don't think it's the best port in there anyway. I don't think there's a best or worse scenario. I think that there's what you need to look at is based on your customer, on your network, on your supply chain network inland, where the infrastructure out of the port is better off to speed up the deliveries than necessarily the port itself. And if you can allow yourself of having, multiple delivery ports instead of only one, I would try to create alternatives and not getting focused on only one scenario and you just dependent on that.
Okay, perfect. And you touched on that a little bit earlier with the flexibility in your supply chain. So another question that's come in, we're now required to make 100% advance payments to secure a place on the waiting list for essential equipment from Europe. In one instance, the lead time has been extended from 10 weeks to 28 weeks without prior notice. This impacts delivery by more than 3 months and turns profit to loss, and the impact on the cash flow is unsustainable. So that's more of a statement there, but I guess they're just looking for a little bit of insight, or if you have any best practices or recommendations for this situation.
I would go hard on that supplier, definitely. I mean, if you can't, again, if it's a sole sourcing scenario and you can't create an alternative, the only approach you can try in the immediate time is negotiate with that supplier and try to partner the supplier, explaining the situations and understanding and finding a way in the middle or somewhere in the middle. Might not be easy, might not work at all, but that's the only chance you have. And try to find what's important for that supplier. Is it really having the money in advance? Why do they need the money in advance? Because they probably have a cash exposure issue, or they don't believe that you're going to be, with the delay in production, then you might cancel the order. So provide commitment in the short period of time and get assurance of that order, or maybe extend your contract with that supplier going beyond. I mean, if you have orders to backlog, that cover yourself until 2023 to sell to them, to your customer, give those suppliers, if you haven't done yet, that visibility and extend their contract, and try to understand if they are more interested into kind of a solvency cash issues in the short term, or a long-term stable revenue stream is something that might be interesting to balance. And that's maybe a negotiation trade-off that can happen. If you have an alternative, I would play hard and try to build an alternative somewhere else, and then try to send a message to that vendor that they're not that indispensable or unique as they believe they are.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and another question that's come in, and I'm not sure how much insight you'll have on the marine industry for this particular question, but what new developing or emerging markets do you see for pleasure boat exporters to compensate for EU markets blocked by tariffs?
I've seen. I mean, I read somewhere that China is a growing market on the boat industry. There seems to be recreational boating industry seems to be trending there. I'm not sure about tariff. Again, I mean, between the U.S. and China at the moment is a little bit playing at the day. But that could be a growing market, definitely a growing one. Latin America at the moment it isn't super growing. It's a little bit of in a past kind of scenario. From data I've seen, and not specific to the marine industry, but data on growth from a consumer perspective, Asia and Southeast Asia is the biggest growing geography at the moment.
Okay, thank you. And next question that we received during this presentation: aircraft OEMs expect their suppliers to work hand in hand with them in product R&D and investment in new technologies. Is this the case in the marine industry? And if not, should it be?
It should be. I mean, if it's not happening, I would definitely go there and work with your partners across the industry to find innovative technology. I mean, one of the way you get, as I said before, I mean, there are some materials or some services that you can't get rid of. That's the basics and that's their nature. But one of the way to de-risk your supply chain is to leverage innovation to build alternative scenarios. And while you are creating those innovations we were referring before based on consumer needs, while you're not creating an ecosystem where you put together multiple suppliers and at the same time create materials and solutions that are less dependable on only one source or only one geography in the world. Really look into an end-to-end in innovation from scratch. And it might be a long-term play, but there's going to be another kind of a risk crisis some point in time in the future, and you don't really want to find yourself in the same kind of situation. You want to really to be able to anticipate. And I'm saying here in the chat, someone talked about 3D printers. Well, that's a kind of an innovation. Yes, absolutely. I mean, the aerospace industry has been thinking about that for a long time. I mean, it's crazy to hold OEM stocks in every single airport they serve. So why not creating 3D printing solutions in locations where they don't want to hold stock and able to, that you could find alternative, you could have flexibility and less financial burden.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And another question we had pop up. The marine industry is currently on allocation with fiberglass, resin, and flotation foam. We all need to increase production by 20 to 30% to reduce our order backlog, which is a good problem to have. Once the allocations are lifted, these suppliers will not be able to supply us with 20 to 30% more materials. Do we have any options, or do you have any recommendations for this short stock in materials?
Well, for the short term, again, I would focus on the mainstream SKU and customer. So try to look from downstream your supply chain. What's important? What kind of SKU do you want to serve first? Try to prioritize that element. What kind of customer do you want to serve first? Are the ones that are been loyal forever and ever? Do you want to capture the new ones? Do you want to serve every single kind of scenario? And try to focus your, in my opinion, try to focus your attention, your resources on what's generating most financial stability, because the worst you can want to find yourself with upset customers and a weak financial positions, and the combination of two is a kind of a dangerous place to be. In the longer run, again, we just talked about that innovation, find alternative if possible and how it's possible. technologies is out there, and we are in a stage of engineering and research and development so advanced in every single industry, that I'm sure that joining the competencies and capability of your industry with your suppliers, that there are alternative solutions that can be found. The fiberglass conversation, I think it's just a little bit different than the resins. The resins is more at the moment kind of a US internal play, in a sense. The fiberglass, there's a kind of a component of offshore sourcing, and that's not only the capacity the issue, is that due to tariff imposition, certain markets are more interesting than others to serve. So obviously, if the capacity is tight, they do exactly what I've just said. They privilege the market where the profitability is higher before the others, and that's what's happening potentially. The interesting thing is that the fiberglass market is foreseen to grow to $16 billion globally by 2027. So I don't think that if I would be a manufacturer in that industry, I would rather look for being able to increase my capacity to serve that growth rather than not. So I think there's going to be a change anyway into that industry that's going to happen. That has to happen.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and businesses are hurting due to the ocean pricing. When will this stop? Can you provide any predictions? And what is the point of increasing cost if the congestion and bottlenecks will not see an end for months out?
I mean, if you look from a physical standpoint, best case scenario talked about 3 months, and worst case scenario to 6 months, kind of a normalcy kind of situation. Based after that, prices should be following a little bit more into normal place, kind of a little bit of a lag time, as I said. But I would say, again, 6 months probably to 6 to 12 months potentially. It's difficult to predict. Where the break even is when air freight is going to cost the same as ocean freight. That point in time, I mean, if ocean freight is not coming down, well, there's no much more leverage or competitive advantage of ocean freight towards air freight. I mean, cost is there. Air are faster than vessels. Yeah, there's a limitation on space, but you have a bunch of A380 that are not useful anymore for passengers. So I guess it's going to be easier to reconvert to a goods carrier rather than leaving them somewhere parked in some runway without any use.
And again, it sounds like the flexibility is key.
Yeah,
knowing your options and being successful.
Well, what I see is that also, and I might be wrong, but the trend was to build big container vessels, very huge, to move a lot of quantities at the same time. I'm not sure that's going to be the trend in future any longer. I mean, it's kind of needed any longer. Probably medium-sized or vessels are probably more agile, easier to maneuver, looking at the Suez Canal happenings. And, when you get to a port, easier to unload and to put into the infrastructure out there on the continent. So in itself, they generate less congestion.
Right. And this kind of falls in line with what we've been discussing, but I want to make sure I touch on all the questions that are coming in. Supply chain demand is not expected to decrease for the remainder of the year. What will help the container shortage return to normalcy in the next 3 to 6 months? It sounds like what you said earlier. We've got to be flexible. We need to know our options, review the pricing, understand the different methods for getting product here, whether that's by air, by ship, depending on price.
Yeah, there's a flexibility. I think you just need to, as I said, I think you need to have, and I'm sure you already started. I don't think I'm saying something that is new or unreasonable. but looking at what you need to serve first, and ideally higher profitability in a way that if you need to use air freight instead of ocean freight to bring home some materials, you have at least a wingle to play in terms of financial to absorb that cost increase. Or if you need to buy on the spot market a shipment, which is a huge price at the moment, you have a wingle price in that environment. I mean, I don't know exactly where your industry profitability is in general. In the industry I'm coming from, the profitability isn't super huge. So, you just need to play very careful with that equations, actually.
Okay, and we just got a question on a component that we've heard a lot of shortages on. Global semiconductor shortages, I believe, coming out of Asia. Is a stabilization of this in sight, or could things worsen and begin to impact supply and pricing going into 2022?
I think it's going to find a solution. Probably it's going to take a few more months, but it made to important task to be addressed and try to find more domestic or alternate scenarios to be solved. Is pricing going down? Again, it depends. I mean, the fact that you create an alternative in different geography partially is going to drive price down because there's more availability of it. That's inherent into the equation. But the fact that you have domestic sourcing doesn't necessarily guarantee that a commodity pricing is cheaper or doesn't fluctuate because of global happenings. There's a certain dependencies anyway, and that need to be considered. But I think the semiconductor situations has made it so huge of a discussion that there's an interest, general interest from different administrations to find a way to get out of it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And the next question is, with what you have advised, how would you suggest an importer to manage and maintain production when the vendors/suppliers are producing per your forecast? So no issues with that supply side, but your carriers cannot hold up their commitment to the weekly forecast.
Again, I think the short term, be creative and manage the situation as the best as you can, and try to find alternative carriers that might be available. But I will start working in anticipation to the future again. I'm sorry, I keep coming on that concept of anticipation because you really want to make sure that you have enough capacity to ship what you need at a point in time sooner rather than later. So you need to start now to guarantee that kind of a level of capacity for your business, and not waiting too long. The other thing is make sure that those carriers have significant penalties if they're not respecting the quantities you are committing. I mean, obviously they need visibility, but if the visibility that is there, what's their incentive to prioritize you rather than someone else? So they need to have skin in the game, and they might have it, but it needs to be tangible, because otherwise, you want to be their priority and not a second choice.
Yeah, so build in incentives into your supplier agreements.
Yes,
to ensure that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how it works necessarily in your industry, but in where I'm coming from, if I'm not delivering Kroger or Publix or Walmart on time, I'm paying penalties. So why my supplier shouldn't be held to the same level of accountability?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great point. So kind of building on that with the planning that you were discussing earlier, how much emphasis should manufacturers place on scenario planning? Should they game out scenarios and the response plans as to what they would do? For example, if the trade war with China continues for years to come, or if a key supplier became insolvent?
I think yes, it should be probably investing in as an industry or as a single entities onto plotting out what are the most possible scenarios of in the future, what kind of variables play are critical for your organizations, and try to understand which are more probable or less probable, and then try to get ready for that, prepare and anticipate for that. So, and it's not only creating a backup plan, for example, in sourcing, is making sure that you test that backup plan. So if things happen, you know what to do and how to do it when you need to activate it.
Okay. And you doing okay? We got a couple more questions here.
Absolutely.
Okay, perfect. So it starts off, you may not have the answer to this, but this is a large struggle we have. As mentioned above, how can you maintain the flow and not pay the $10,000 plus for the one-offs that our carriers cannot help provide the space as they should? Does that make sense?
Say that again.
So as mentioned above, how can you maintain the flow and not pay the $10,000 plus for the one-offs that their carriers cannot help provide the space?
Well, if you have an alternative, you can say I'm not paying the $10,000 and you go to someone else. But if you don't have alternative and you need that materials, and in the short term, I mean, there's nothing more you can do in the short time. And one alternative could be, if you can bring it by air freight, that could be an alternative. I'm not sure is that much. Well, potentially if it's $10,000, that might be cheaper, but that's an alternative scenario. Or if it's a material that you need only for a specific product that you have to produce, maybe you postpone that product and you privilege others that you might be able to put in production and to sell to your customer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's really no option for the air freight when the materials, the sizes and weights too large or too heavy.
No, and I'm happy to talk about the specific case. I mean, in a generic, my answer was very generic, but I mean, if the person is interested in and want to reach out into the specific, I'm happy to have a deep dive conversation.
Okay. And one of the things that I'm kind of picking up from the discussion, from the earlier questions and the questions here in the chat box, is strategic planning is extremely, extremely important when it comes to supply chain, executing supplier agreements, making sure that you've incentivized the supplier to make you priority. We have another question, and this goes to some of the restrictions on chemicals here in the U.S. This one's in regards to flotation foam. So there was a restriction on 134A chemical that's used in the flotation foam, and our industry has identified HFO as an alternative, but it's been crippled by the supply chain. Do we have any resources or are there any methods that we could strong arm suggestions for the Hill to seek exceptions for us to use the 134A to prevent these short stocks and these shortages within production?
You mean to waive the restrictions?
Yeah, either waive the restrictions or come up with exceptions. Do you have an inside track on how we could go about that?
Depends how strong your industry lobby is. That's an alternative. You can push and say, that's the loss to the industry. I've seen that happen. I mean, I've seen that in an industry that are lobbying and making pressure on a certain regulator and try to not to waive complete legislations, but to postpone certain date of validity or certain regulations. The only things that, if I would be the regulator in that case, I would be happy to listen, but when the alternative and what's the alternative and when the alternative is going to be available? Because if there's no end date, then I wouldn't be waiving or making an exception. Okay.
And Crystal Jacoby, she actually submitted that particular question, And what I'll do is I'll reach out to our GR team. We have a very, very strong and active GR team in DC. I'll pass this along and see if they can get in touch with you to provide some information or insight as to their activities and what they're trying to do to help support you there. And it looks like in the Q&A, I think we've covered all the questions there. And I think I saw a couple come in from the chat. 3D printers will fix everything. Let's see.
Yeah, try to pick it up.
I think David appreciated your response. And Paul had asked or said that was a good question. Could you restate it? And I apologize. I'm not sure which question you're referring to, Paul. If you're still here. So like I said, this session will be recorded, so you can always go back and rewatch it. Let me just double check and make sure there are no additional questions in the Q&A. So I guess that's it for the seminar. Just a few additional housekeeping notes to go over before we officially close out. As a reminder, the on-demand materials will be emailed to everyone within a few days. This email will include a link to the recording of today's presentation and a survey link. We would appreciate you taking the time to give us your feedback. Your feedback helps ensure that we provide important and relevant material in these sessions. So please make sure you take the time, fill that out. Let us know what topics are creating issues for your business, and we'll do our best to get the experts in here, just like we did with Dr. Sorty and the supply chain. Again, I'd like to thank Dr. Sorty. Thank you so much, and to the University of Tennessee for coming in, helping us out, providing some guidance here. This was a great discussion today, and I want to thank all of the attendees for taking time out of their day to join us. In addition, I'd also like to thank Ann Dunbar, Patty Lawrence, and Kate Holden for putting this together, and Laura for handling the virtual platform. This webinar, again, was brought to you by IBEX and the NMMA team. Thank you again, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you.